I'll do some sort of long rambling introduction for you all, just to give you some time to settle in, take your seats and understand what we're going to talk about today, what sort of topic. So welcome, 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 everyone. Seniorcare by Lottie's webinar on how flexible working can save caregivers at work. Save caregivers at work. That sounds quite extreme, but I have to disagree, actually. We've got this little factoid that I'm going to say at the top to just really drill home what that sort of means. At Seniorcare by Lottie, we've noticed a 300% increase in the Google search, giving up work to be a carer. Now, that probably sounds like a lot because it is a lot. You don't want hundreds of percentages of increases in people saying they want to give up work to be a carer. And it isn't too hard to imagine why people would do it, but, you know, join me if you will. Imagine a caregiver. Think about their day-to-day at work. They've got several meetings, they've got deadlines to meet, and not a lot of time to probably do that within. Now picture their loved one needing immediate care within that time. So you have to imagine that some of these people are working, 9 to 5s, and then probably a 5 to 9 straight after as well. And no one has the capacity or mental bandwidth to be able to do that, at least not for long, without proper support. So my question is flexible working the salve to that absenteeism, the mental health woes, and the lack of retention that unpaid caregiving can bring in an organization? And luckily for you guys, I'm not the expert in that. I'm actually joined by two glorious experts with me today. Very excited to introduce them to you today. We have Molly Johnson-Jones, who is an expert in all things flexible work and is the co-founder of Flexa. Welcome, Molly. Molly experience of being fired for asking to work from home one day a week to accommodate her autoimmune condition is what first drove her to set up Flexa. Now the platform is relied on by over 1 million users in 100 different countries and works with the likes of Mars, Virgin, O2, LV, and TUI. So welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have you on and get your expertise on the subject. And my other guest today is Chris Donnelly. He founded and was CEO of Verb Brands, a company he grew into one of the largest and most recognized luxury digital agencies. But now he's on a mission to elevate later life for everyone and shake up the social care scene by building a care home marketplace, Lottie, and Seniorcare by Lottie, which is aimed at organizations. These endeavors have empowered care seekers to find the right care for them and bring better balance to their lives. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, mate.
So before we begin the session today, I'd just like to reiterate it's being recorded. So if you are missing it today, don't worry, you're watching this back. Maybe you're watching it back right now. Hi, me in the future. So don't worry about that. And also we have a Q&A section designated at the end. So if you do have any questions on flexible working and caregiving and flexibility within work, do just pop your question in the Q&A tab on Zoom and we will get to it, I promise. But yeah, you can ask those questions whenever and throughout. Anyway, that is enough waffle from me. I've just been monologuing for the last minute or so. So I think everyone listening would love to hear from both Molly and Chris. So Chris, to kick us off, to give us a bit of context to the situation of caregiving at work, what are the day-to-day challenges a caregiver will face?
Yeah, so just a quick, sorry, my asthma is so bad today that I am short of breath. So don't think I'm like struggling. I'm totally fine. It's just
if you ever want to take a breather, you can.
Yeah, well, I suppose I might have to because I speak fast. So well, yeah, so I suppose it's a good question to kick us off. And I think that obviously the reason Will and I actually started Lottie originally was, I suppose, watching the experience that our mum was going through, being a sort of quasi caregiver for her mum, and also just witnessing the whole experience of, our grandparents getting older and what that toll took on the family. And I think that in those situations, like, so much love and passion and attention, goes on the person who's experiencing, who requires the care. which I think obviously is right, but you do obviously forget in many situations that the caregiver is going through one hell of an ordeal themselves. And I think that one of the things that we speak about a lot is that like sandwich generation of people who are, caught between, caring for their parents, might be relatively acute care, very full-on care, for example, and at the same time having children and working. And it is obviously very challenging. And I think companies can, accommodate, make accommodations to support people. But I think some of the day-to-day stuff will be anything from feeling isolated, so not being supported, and that leads to loneliness. And obviously, loneliness is a horrible thing to experience day to day. I think that you take for granted that sleep deprivation is obviously one of the things that becomes very significant especially if you're doing a job that requires a lot of hours and you're being a caregiver. You really are doing 9 to 5 and 5 to 9. I think that the amount of people that you hear complain about the onset of loneliness, isolation, and depression is very, very common when being a caregiver. And then the other thing that's not, again, spoken about enough is the financial. I remember talking to my mum. It's my first experience of it was years ago, but I remember talking to her just about the amount of money she spent on petrol, like going back and forth to her mum's house who lived in Harpenden. So yeah, I think that everything from emotional through to financial, and I think that burnout and loneliness, the things they experience most from an emotional standpoint.
Yeah, well, did you experience any of that yourself when it came to your grandmother, needing the right care? And because I assume you were juggling full-time work, maybe more than full-time, overtime work, plus thinking about, your grandmother's care, like how difficult was that for you to find that balance? Could you find a balance?
So I don't know, I haven't told anyone Lottie this. So my brother and I have a relatively complex life in general. In that our dad is unfortunately a very ill person as well. We then had the complication of our grandparents being very ill at the same time. And so like our family is none of it's sort of new or surprising to us. I think that generally speaking, I would say that guys are quite useless when it comes to this stuff in comparison to our counterparts. And I think that my brothers and I have always been more acutely aware. And I think maybe because Will's background was in the care industry. And so I think, it can certainly be time, it certainly can have an impact on your time, especially when, again, my two brothers are entrepreneurs, so we all work a lot as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's certainly had an impact at the time, and it still does today.
Yeah, I think you can sort of sense that some of that, that emotional toil, as well as just like functional toil as well, that it takes on your life, having to, think about caring for a loved one and then your career at the same time when, that's so difficult in and of itself in isolation. But then, yeah, I think you can see some of those risks coming through. Molly, what kind of options are available to employees and employers when it comes to flexible working? Like, what's a good starting point, and what are some great examples that you've seen over the years? I think she might be frozen.
Did we lose Molly?
I know it happens. Molly's in the Starlink on Starlink in Wales, and she did say just before she came on that she might have some internet troubles, and it just so happens she's had it at this time. Hi, Molly. Hi. I was just asking you the question. I'm delighted to ask you again. I was just going to say, what kind of options are available to employers when it comes to flexible working? Where's a good place to start? And what are some good examples you've seen over the years?
Yeah, I think one brilliant thing that did come out of the pandemic, and probably the only good thing that came out of the pandemic, was a real shift in the way that we think about how work and life sort of come together. It used to be very much that, work was a place you went in 5 days a week, you worked somewhere between, well, back when I was doing it, like 6:30 in the morning through to 8 at night, and you had no choice over where that was done, and nor did you talk about whether you needed accommodations or whether you had caring responsibilities. You somehow sort of made that work, and it took a massive sacrifice on people's well-being and ability to manage their work and life. Like, even from a very, very minor perspective, I'm sure we all remember the days where you'd get to Friday night and you'd have so much washing that you'd be like trying to struggle to do it all over the weekend.
Yeah.
But, you know, washing is a, you know, pretty trivial part of it, but that is what happens with so many people's other commitments outside of life, whether it was caregiving, suddenly trying to spend the entire weekend with their family because they weren't spending any time during the week, whether that's children, whether that's elderly relatives, whether that was their partners. And so since obviously the pandemic shifted, when we were at home consistently, starting to mesh these two worlds together, there's now obviously been this beneficial sort of paradigm shift in the way that we think about work and life really coming together. So companies have adapted to that in so many different ways. You know, we see on Flexa that we've got about 500,000 different searches being conducted for different ways of working. So that could be dog-friendly offices, remote first, hybrid 2 days a week, work from anywhere schemes, you know, being able to travel the world, whatever it might be. But increasingly, there is this demand for information about carers leave or around parental leave or childcare, you know, all of those things that come associated with when you're looking after a dependent. And companies are really leaning into it. I think, sadly, carers leave is a little bit behind the kind of parental leave side of things and childcare because it's just less recognised. But, you know, as we increasingly have an aging population in this country, you know, it's much worse in some other countries as well. This is going to be a problem that employers are going to face more and more. So what we're seeing is, and I think there's probably 3 ways that companies can really help with carers when it comes to supporting them and enabling them to juggle or attempt to juggle work and caring responsibilities. The first one is kind of obvious, I guess, like location flexibility, whether that's fully remote, whether that's remote first, whether that's hybrid, 3 days a week, 2 days a week, 1 day a week. Obviously being able to work from somewhere where that individual is makes it much easier. Also saves on petrol going back and forth to Chris's, right? So being able maybe 2 days a week to go and work from where you're looking after that person will make a huge impact. So with flexible hours, if you have flexible hours or core hours where you can kind of work around going and visiting them in the morning or going and seeing them at lunchtime to cook them food, whatever it might be, that makes a massive difference when it comes to being able to, again, you might have a longer overall working day, but you're kind of chopping and changing in between it. And the demand for flexible hours has increased massively as well. And now around 57% of people say that they want flexible hours. It's for a myriad of reasons, but caring responsibilities is definitely one of them. And then the final one is above statutory carers leave. We were talking before this webinar, but around 20 companies on Flexa have above statutory carers leave, which is up significantly from this time last year, where I believe it was only about 5 companies. So thankfully that is becoming more common and more recognised. And I think more companies are going to lean into it as they see that the top talent that they want to retain is likely to face these challenges in the future. And if they want to keep them, they're going to have to adapt.
That's great. I mean, it's so good to hear that people are now starting to up their carers leave policy and upgrade it. You know, statutory, just to give people context, everyone now is entitled to 1 week, so 5 days unpaid leave to take care or to either take care of an elderly loved one or source their sort of care solution, which is the bare minimum. And it's great that the government have actually recognized that. And it's really good that the government, you know, have implemented it and passed it in law. But, you know, organizations can do so much more. And it's so good to hear that, you know, 20 organizations on Flexa are actually, you know, doing that and a bit more. Chris, I was wondering, like, when it comes to, you know, what is the most effective form of flexible working with for a caregiver, would you say? Is it that flexible hours, choosing when you work during the day? Perhaps you can take, you know, an elderly loved one to the hospital for an appointment, or is it that remote work and actually having that base that's closer to your elderly loved ones? What for you helps a caregiver more?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it's always very difficult to manage everything perfectly in every moment. And so I think that, like, for example, at Lottie and at my previous companies, we've always had pretty fixed rules in the company for people to like know exactly how to operate within the company. So there's no ambiguity, for example. But I think on top of that, you then have what Molly said, which is you have built-in benefits like core hours, or, you know, you only require people to be in the office 2 days a week, for example. And you have all of these rules. And I think that that's good because it gives people a real clear understanding of what's expected to them. But it also helps people on the way into a company to understand what that company stands for, is available, and so forth. And there's a point nowadays where if you are a car mechanic, manufacturing mechanic, it's harder to have these benefits than a company like ours, which is predominantly software computer based. So I think that you've got to measure it all appropriately when putting it in place. But I think that all of that being said, I think the thing that matters most is that this stuff happens almost on a dime. Like I've experienced things in our family where 1 week, you're in the sort of, happy life, it's amazing, etc. And then suddenly something happens, someone's had a fall or someone deteriorates, or, you get some really bad medical news, and immediately your family sort of descends into chaos for a prolonged period of time. And I think that common sense prevails. If someone is having a really hard period of time, on top of the policies that you have in place, you can make accommodations. And I think that that's in many ways, I think that shows the sort of the soul and the heart of the company, is that in those moments, you provide them additional flexibility and support on top of the rules. And I think that I know a lot of companies who don't do that. And like I said at the beginning, I think it's very important to have clear rules in a company. I think it's important as you scale, when you get to, I don't know, Robin, how many people we are now, but like maybe 75 people or something. When you get to that level, you can't have a one-on-one conversation about every single policy. So you need policies, you need structure. However, in someone's dark, challenging moment, you also need empathy to say, I understand. And maybe for the next 4 weeks, we say, you come in once a week, or you have even more flexibility around your hours, or, we've extended carers leave, whatever it might be. I think that you can do more than your policies, I suppose, is my point, because every situation is different.
I think that's a really good point, actually. And the thing that I think is important to pick up on there is laying the foundations first, so that when your life does turn on a dime, which it oftenly does, and your life does flip upside down, that you actually have the policies in place that are already implemented, that can be used for flexible working. And I think that's the point. You don't want to have to think about, oh, what do we do now, and try and implement something then. It's almost too late. It's almost like it's only going to add anxiety and stress to the situation, because you're not aware of any sort of flexible working policies or anything like that to help yourself. So I think that's really important to set that framework right off the bat. So I guess what we touched on there is like why caregivers might need that balance and where they can sort of start in an organization view. But how do you begin to implement it and make it personal for the demographic of your employees? Molly, where should an organization start when adopting flexible working? Should they, reach out to their employees? Should they, I don't know, do something completely different? Should they talk to Flexa, obviously? Where would you recommend that they start?
Yeah, I think offering flexible working or changing your work environment to be more flexible is quite an iterative process. Like I've seen a lot of companies make the mistake of like, oh, we need to do all of this research, and then in a year we're going to be ready to announce what we're going to do in terms of hybrid working or flexible hours or whatever it might be. Your first suggestion is obviously like reaching out to employees. That makes complete sense, right? What do people ultimately want? And you don't have to please everybody, I think, is always the fear when you reach out to employees and all of a sudden you get all of these strange requests. Like we get requests on Flexa, like, can I understand which companies have dehumidifiers? And we're like, I don't know. I don't think that's a particularly big demand. Is for
How often do you get asked that on Flexa?
We've had two. But obviously you don't need to please everybody with it. I always say that trying to aim for sort of 70 to 80%, the majority, is a pretty good suggestion. And I think when you're then considering, if people say, oh, I'd love core hours of 11 till 4 or 11 till 3 and coming into the office twice a week rather than 3 times a week would really suit me, whatever it might be. Is then thinking about flexibility as a two-way street. Like I always say that flexibility should be, or your work environment should be based on a framework that balances both individual needs and their ability to thrive, but also business needs. What is the most effective way to work that will mean that your company can maintain its culture, meet its goals, and maintain high performance teams, etc. So start asking employees, then I would look at it and think about what your first iteration will be. It might be that there's only small moves that will happen that the leadership team are comfortable with. So it might be that you go from 4 days a week in the office to 3, you go from 9 till
I think it's that old internet again.
Nine forever.
Yeah, 9 till forever, I believe she was going to say. I guess on the point of listening to employees, Chris, how important is that? How important is it to listen to employees and finding out what the broad spectrum actually want?
I think Molly might be back.
Oh, Molly, hi.
You're back. You actually cut out at, you said 9 until, and then we lost you.
9 until infinity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if you just want to finish that point of like finding that right balance of flexible working.
And moving in small increments, so 9 till 5 to grow out, 10 till 4, whatever it might be, and monitoring the impact that has on productivity, on people's happiness, on also, people's ability to juggle work and life, because the whole point of flexible working is not for it just to be on the side of the employee. There's also massive benefits for the employer, because if you create an environment in which everybody can thrive, whether that's people that have dependents that they're caring for, whether that's helping men to spend more time with their children rather than it always falling on women, whether it's people balancing, disabilities, autoimmune diseases, whatever it might be, you're going to get more out of that person if you don't put them in that really, really rigid box. So I'd always say to try to measure that performance and make sure that you're monitoring engagement and happiness over time as well. And then you can make those incremental changes in the future. There's loads of studies that suggest that flexible working, particularly hybrid, so like 1, 2, or 3 days a week in the office, has an enormous upside when it comes to talent attraction, engagement, retention, and also productivity. So I think a lot of people that are very scared that if they suddenly move to flexibility, there's going to be this huge fallout and the business is going to perform worse. Some of the most wide-scale studies that have been done on this topic really do suggest the opposite.
I guess on that, why are companies so against flexible working? Some, I mean, not all of them are. I like to think that the majority are now moving in a wave towards flexibility and flexible working and remote working.
Yeah.
But why are some organizations afraid to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still not quite the majority that offer flexible working as standard, sadly. But I think there's a real mixture of reasons that there is this fear around it. I think if you think about the people that are setting these policies and setting these ways of working, they made their careers going into the office 5 days a week, meeting people in person, working very set hours. So it's kind of a bit of a, well, I did it that way, so why don't you sort of mentality. I think there's also a bit of a fear of the unknown, because management for decades has been done on presenteeism mostly, right? If you see somebody, they're at work, you assume they're working. Whereas operating distributed teams or flexible teams requires much more intentional management. And I think a lot of people don't know how to do that. It's also a lot more work to get more out of people, but, having to set those KPIs, having to have difficult conversations with people when they're underperforming, rather than just saying, well, you're not in the office today, so it means you're not working.
Yeah.
And then I also think that there is just a sort of wider stigma attached to it that working flexibly means you're less committed. And I think that's a real shame, because it massively detriments women and people with caring responsibilities and people with disabilities in particular, because they cannot work in an inflexible way. So it means that you're tarred with that less committed brush, even though you're trying to do your best to balance both work and life.
Yeah, because there is a sort of unconscious bias, would you say, Chris, there to maybe caregivers. And, something we found at Seniorcare by Lottie is that 400% more women are likely to drop their hours or leave their role altogether for caregiving responsibilities. And I know I've mentioned 300%, and now I've mentioned 400%. Will I go to 500%? But I guess I'm making the point that diversity, inclusivity piece is really important, and there is an unconscious bias there. How important is that to make that as important as possible for organizations to think about actually how are we empowering caregivers, how are we empowering more women in the workplace, and making flexibility the norm. Like how important is that?
I think obviously we up here are dealing with often a very acute challenge that has such a huge ramp in the amount of time it takes on your life.
Yeah.
From you know, it might be, you know, a few hours a week helping with groceries, chores, admin, tech support, whatever it might be. And, you know, at my age, that stuff is already starting to creep in with my parents. But then you have this ramp, and, you know, we broadly provide, you know, employers with the ability that their employees don't have to put all of that time in themselves, right? So we're trying to help people to understand care, caregiving, support. You know, we're trying to help people cut down their decision time, trying to help them understand what their company should be doing for them. So yeah, I think that it's such a significant problem. But again, there's one of these weird things, especially with later life care and illness, that people don't like talking about it. It is quite a private thing, and so it's very rarely given the time of day that it should, which is why the leave and so forth has fallen behind so significantly. But like Molly says, like, we have a hugely aging population. You know, we are bad. There are places that are worse. There are places that are better. But this will be a recurrent theme everywhere in the world moving forwards now. And so when you're at work and you suddenly have a parent that goes from being like needing help to needing to move into care or to get care, you have people who tell us that they're spending 30 to 40 hours a week on the challenge, which will be research, support, guidance, you know, being there in person. And so again, like I said, you know, you need a company to understand that, you know, there will be rules and there will be parameters, but there's also emergency situations.
Yeah.
As well.
For those people that are spending 30, 40 hours a week trying to untangle and solve the situation, what advice would you give them, Chris?
Well, I don't want to plug our product, but what I would say is, so much of what you're going through is a relatively well-trodden path.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is an enormous amount of education and material out there around the steps to take. And I think that obviously there is what's provided from a statutory point of view, but I think that, you know, what we try and do is we try and give people a quicker way of making a better decision, which is more vetted. And so the whole point of Seniorcare is that an employee, when they're stressing and they haven't got the available amount of time, can turn to a team and say, you know, can you help me understand my funding? Like, how much does the state provide? Like, what's available to me? You know, what's the difference between nursing and residential care or home care? You know, what can I get quickly? What are the steps? And I think that, you know, we witness this in the office all the day, because our care team actually sit here. So you hear them talking to people every single day, and the phone calls are so emotional because people are in their lowest of low moments. And so it's about providing people information, but often it's actually providing a bit of a shoulder in many regards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree more. And it's about that personal touch, isn't it? I love that. Molly, how can organizations make flexible work more bespoke to their teams, to their employees? Like, what sort of advice would you give them?
I'd say number one is, you know, you'll have your policies and the things that are in writing, but they won't always be applicable to every situation that you're in. And I think that's something that's very important to bear in mind. And that adjustments can be made on a temporary basis as well. So it might be, you know, if there is a period of time where somebody is spending 30, 40 hours caring for somebody and associated admin, you know, that's not really manageable with a 40-hour week, really. So it might be that there's an agreement that you both come to where it makes sense for them to set down to part-time, or, you know, whatever it might be, or take a mixture of unpaid and paid leave, whatever that might be. So I think being flexible on it and trying to understand what you can offer on a case-by-case basis is very important. And I think a lot of companies are quite fearful of that because they're like, oh, but it sets a precedent and anyone can do that. And I think that's a very weak argument, because not everybody's going to be in that position where they're spending 30, 40 hours a week caring for somebody. And again, it comes back to that point that working is supposed to be in order to help that individual thrive and be most productive as possible. And that obviously has a benefit to the business as well. So if somebody can keep working part-time while also obviously going through a period of much more demanding care and more demanding hours of that makes sense for the business, because you're still getting something out of them rather than them completely crumbling and potentially having to leave their job if they're a high performer. So I'd always have that in mind when you're thinking about those case-by-case basis and those adjustments, is don't just stick to what's in policy and what's in writing. Obviously, even large organizations, I've heard of in extenuating circumstances have deviated from policy, and they said, well, this makes sense in the team. And obviously employment lawyers know all about that. Like, it's relatively easy to get half an hour of advice on exactly how you can structure it so that you're pretty safe. So I would really encourage an honest and two-way conversation, because people in these scenarios are often struggling, and it's not that they're trying to take the piss and do less work here. Like, what they're trying to do is make both sides of their life manageable and continue to work and earn money while also in a very difficult position. So having a very human conversation about it in the beginning, I think, is really important, and then looking at how you can both compromise to make something work together. And I think, for startups, that will obviously come from probably not an HR person, probably not a lawyer. It's probably going to be a one-to-one conversation with a manager or with somebody in the senior team. But in large organizations, obviously, they're very well set up for that kind of thing anyway. So welcoming and making a safe space to have those conversations, because as Chris said, this isn't something that's talked about very much. There is a bit of a taboo around it. People really struggle talking about kind of health conditions and that kind of thing, particularly within families. So making sure that there is a culture of being able to speak openly and trust that person that they're trying to do the best thing for both themselves and for their family.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, the sort of the taboo that exists about talking about a loved one with care. Like, there's a sense of pride and a sort of sense of, this is a personal matter, we can deal with it ourselves. And whilst I understand that, I think for an organization to be, open to that and actually say, come to us if you need assistance with this, is such a powerful statement to make, because it suddenly makes that door open, doesn't it? And it makes that conversation alive. And it makes people not like afraid to come and speak to their manager about caregiving and things like that. So yeah, I completely get that's a good place to start. How often would you recommend that companies deviate from their their statutory or contractual obligations?
I think it's such a case-by-case basis. It's going to depend on the size of company. I mean, we've never had that yet at Flexa, but I know of many companies that have asked for our advice as well on what to do when that kind of thing happens. Obviously, it can't be that you have everybody on a case-by-case basis. Like, that's incredibly difficult to manage, but also the likelihood of that happening is quite low. So I'd say start with open conversations and make sure that people feel comfortable saying when something's really not working and it's impacting their performance, and also training managers on it, right? Like, if somebody's performance suddenly dips, you can't just assume it means it's because they're doing a terrible job and they don't care anymore. Often there are things going on at home, and affording trust and a bit of compassion to those kind of situations makes conversations much more constructive and much less hostile.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. My next question, I suppose, is to both of you. How does flexible working, I mean, Molly, you touched on it a bit earlier, but how does flexible working benefit the organization? I think we've got such a good sense of how it does benefit the employee, especially one of those with unpaid caregiving responsibilities. But how is this directly benefiting organizations?
Who should go first?
Directed at Molly, you go.
Sure. So there are loads of different benefits of flexible working. The first one is what I've mentioned before around enabling people to have an environment in which they can thrive. Like, if you take somebody with a disability or a chronic health condition like I have, like, I literally could not work full time without flexible working. It'd be impossible. And there are millions of people out there that are in exactly the same position. And as more and more people have caring responsibilities or have children or whatever it might be, that is only going to increase further. So the first one is companies being able to get the most out of their employees, because not everybody is going to fit into being able to work in that 5-day-a-week, very rigid scenario. Some people can, and it totally works for them. And that's great, because flexibility is about choice. You also can go into the office 5 days a week and work really set hours if you want to. It's not about telling everybody that they have to work in a certain way. So the first one is, creating an environment in which different people from different backgrounds can thrive. That then naturally feeds into diversity. Like, it's been mentioned briefly before about the fact that women are much more likely to leave because of caring responsibilities. But women ethnic minorities, people of different sexual orientations, people with disabilities are significantly more likely to leave a role if flexibility was taken away as well. There is a direct correlation between flexible working and inclusivity and diversity. So it's really important to bear that in mind, because now companies are being pretty rigorously held to the diversity targets that they set, and they're coming up very fast and they're struggling to meet them. So flexibility is a slam dunk way to ensure that you're setting a decent foundation to try to meet those diversity goals. And then the third one is ultimately like productivity, the ability to attract talent that's going to be able to thrive in your organization, and being very clear about that too. Chris, you mentioned it very earlier, around the fact that you've got these rules, people know where they stand, they know what they can and can't do. And I think it's really important for organizations to talk about all of that up front, so that people, before they've even applied, before they've even had an interview, can make an educated decision about whether that company is the right company for them. And that's why we started Flexa, because that information just wasn't available anywhere. So I think very, very important to bear that in mind, is like, you can have all of this flexibility, but if you're hiding it behind the scenes, then you're not going to attract aligned talent that's going to thrive in that different working environment, because a remote company is very different to hybrid 3 days a week to hybrid 1 day a week, flexible hours, whatever else it might be. So I think those are kind of 3 different areas. Also, if you're not flexible, you're going to have to pay a lot more in terms of salaries, because people associate flexibility with approximately 10 to 15% of salary.
I mean, that's pretty much how I would answer it, if I'm honest. There's not much more I can add to that. I think that it's very cool that companies like Flexa exist these days, because if I take a look back, when I ran my previous company, we were like, I don't know, 100 employees at one point. This is pre-COVID. So, but we and myself, we were like advocating strongly for flexible work, because we had flexible work. We had core hours back then, pre-COVID. And we were really loud about it, and it became a great attraction tool for us. And I would say that nowadays we try and be very loud about our policies today and like what we stand for. And the reason we do that is twofold. One, it's great attraction, but two, it's amazing alignment, right? And so when people apply and they work really hard to get a job here because it's very competitive and fast growth company and all the rest of it, if they then turn up and suddenly are like, I want to work a completely different way, I think common sense prevails in the sense that you always try and support people. But I think that person and you are aware that the company works a certain way. And so I always think that the signposting is so important, because like, if you went to work in an office that said it's 5 days a week in the office, and like you say, they might pay more and so forth, and then you expect them to wind all of that back, it's just a bit unrealistic. And, you know, I think over the years, you do get an unbelievable myriad of requests across the business as you grow from people. And the people side of the business I always find fascinating. And that's why I think it's important to like have rules, have, you know, policies and practices that are in place, and you're upfront and you're transparent about them, and they're great. And then on a case-by-case basis, you can bend the rules to accommodate people, but you don't. I never feel bad when someone's like, I want a completely different way of working. Can you offer it? If we say no, it's because our way of working, we're very comfortable with what we offer. And I think it's very important that you don't just provide all flexibility completely. And I think, again, one of the things that I am quite passionate about is I think that bigger companies should be held to a stronger account on being able to offer a wider range of flexibility. Because I've obviously run companies over the years where, you know, there's 5 of us in a room and we're such a small company that we're struggling to pay the wage bill. So like if 2 or 3 people were to step back their work, work 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, work less hours, suddenly the company itself struggles. And so I think that the quality, what we hold people to account for, I do think startups should be given a bit of a wider berth. And as you get bigger, I think that the big companies should have a much greater focus on diversity and inclusion and flexibility, which I don't think they do. Startups seem to accommodate it faster, which is quite ironic. Yeah,
I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that it's almost like actually for the company to endorse the right flexibility, they almost have to signpost it immediately. That's kind of what you were saying, and make the narrative about what they offer and what they're doing. What's your day-to-day going to look like? Because then you get the sort of people that want to work for you. And if it is a startup, it's mission driven, and it is the sort of like, this is what your day-to-day is going to look like. This is what you're working towards. And this is the sort of flexibility you can expect. And then, yeah, you're right. It isn't hidden behind a paywall, and it isn't this sort of service that is, that is a surprise when you get there and you go, oh, I thought I'd have more flexibility than this. And I think that open communication between an employer and employee is so, so important. If you don't have that, you lack that sort of open communication, and not just like flexibility wise, just caregiving demands, maybe it's something else, like something healthcare related. You lose all that because the company is not willing to communicate openly. So yeah, I think that's really good. And every application I'm now going to see from now on is going to have a slightly different feel to it, because I think it has to be a bit more transparent, and it has to be completely layered on the line what they're offering. I've got kind of one final question for you both, and it can be sort of as open-ended and sort of maybe abstract as you like, but what can an organization do to be more forward-thinking when it comes to ways of working? What would you love to see organizations doing next, essentially, and how will they evolve?
I think that's more to you than me, Molly.
So I think that probably the biggest shift that I would like to see is more of a shift in mentality. I think giving flexibility is very much seen currently by the media, by a lot of leaders, as something that is only for the individual, and that it's more of a sacrifice from the company. Whereas actually, I think if we really think about why a company would offer all of these things, we've gone through all of the benefits, it's actually really a two-way street, and you're going to get the most out of somebody. Obviously, massive impacts from a retention perspective and attrition. And also, as Chris said, like, it can become this huge selling point, and it means that you get your pick of talent and you pay a lot less for it. Like a Flexa, we've only ever used Flexa to hire, and we've never spent £1 on hiring, and we've hired dozens of people through our platform because of being very transparent about the flexibility that we offer. So I think it's a shift in mentality of seeing flexible working as ultimately the future, because you're going to be able to hire more diverse talent more easily, save money, get the most out of people, and also people will move from an inflexible company to a flexible company. So I'd love to see people think about it more as an opportunity rather than this big sacrifice that companies have to make and an inconvenience, because I think as we start to think about it as an opportunity, there'll be so much natural evolution and progression. We've moved from 100 years ago, it was 6 days a week, 10-hour long days, very manual work. Like now we've moved to 40-hour weeks, 50-hour weeks, whatever it might be, with a much more fluidity and mobility when we can work from our laptops. Obviously, if you're in a factory or a car mechanic, it's very different. So I think only by embracing it as a positive shift are we really going to make the most out of this future of work and the evolution of work, and get to the point where ultimately we're trying to increase company productivity while also massively improving people's quality of life, because that's the aim of the game ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah. And can you see that narrative flipping, do you think, at Flexa? Do you see it firsthand, that sort of narrative from being like, oh, this is like a salary sacrifice like scheme, to suddenly becoming, actually, no, this is something quite empowering and something we're really passionate about, and it's becoming the norm? Like,
yeah, it really depends on the company, and also the individual. I'm sure, Chris, given your LinkedIn following, you get a lot of hate on LinkedIn as well, but like the amount of arguments that I've had to avoid because of people seeing it as, people taking the piss and everybody needs to go back to work, and if you're working from home, it means you're watching Netflix in your underwear. Whereas like ultimately that's really not what's happening for 95% of people.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is still a long way to go from a mentality shift perspective, but the most forward-thinking companies are leading the way, and they are seeing huge benefits from it, from a talent attraction perspective and diversity and well-being perspective as well. So I think we're making more progress now than we were pre-pandemic, but it's not happening enormously fast because there's still a long lots of very sort of anarchic, sort of like archaic views that people have around, if you're not in the office, you're not working.
Yeah, there's still a lot of resistance there.
I certainly used to get a shitload of hate back in the day, pre-pandemic, when I was advocating for certain work policies like remote work, flexible work, core hours, like IVF and miscarriage leave, things like that. Like back in the day, pre-COVID, you would be like slammed in the comments. And that's actually what originally built my profile, was the arguments in sections of my posts sent all of my posts viral, because everyone wanted to tell me and tell the world that any time that you had off work was being lazy, which I fundamentally disagree with. I also think that if you flip it on its head for a moment, if you're a company and you're not able to spot your staff's productivity, not their presenteeism, then you are a shit company. Like, you do not have the right processes in place. You are strategically very bad at managing your business. If you can't like see someone's work, and so obviously people will take the piss. Of course they will. People will. I have friends that play PlayStation all day but have full-time jobs. I would say in many ways, like, obviously they're idiots, sure, but like their company are just technologically, strategically poor to not realize that just because they're like wiggling their mouse every hour doesn't mean they're working. So like, I think you can't be so outspoken about it if you yourself haven't adapted the very like fundamentals of the companies nowadays. Like, we have to know if someone is good at their job, and if they're not good at their job, they should be let go. But like, should provide people flexibility, and that's a completely separate thing.
There's no correlation between flexible working and avoiding work. Like, I used to sit behind a guy in an office 5 days a week who spent about 60% of the time watching the cricket with a dark screen on, so you couldn't see it unless you were directly behind him. He's the kind of person that is also playing PlayStation while having a full-time job, but like, they're gonna do it anywhere. Like, it's got nothing to do with where they are,
whether they're in the office or at home. How important then is, I mean, this is almost like a different webinar altogether, but then how important is target setting? How important is saying those?
The most important thing.
Yeah, because then if they're getting the job done, then what's the problem? How they're working, the way in which they're doing it, looking after an elderly loved one on the side. Like, why is it?
The thing I always laugh about is like, if someone can do the job in 3 days, like, we should be giving them more work. And it's like, well, again, it's a tricky one, because like, if I know what I want from someone and they're able to do it slightly faster and buy themselves more time, cool. Like, honestly, cool. You do you type thing. But then again, like, when people don't get, like, Robin, you've seen it, like, all we talk about at Lottie is like the mission, the vision, and the targets, because the mission and the vision are like, they're a steer, they're like where we're going, but the targets is like the rails of like how we're going to get there. And if you can't live up to those targets as a business like ours, you just wouldn't exist. So yeah, I mean, you've got to keep people focused on the productivity.
That's it. And that's when sometimes mission isn't, always like the determining factor. Mission is the drive. Mission is why you want to get there, but then the targets are always like how you're going to show it and how you're going to get there. And that's just as important, because otherwise you don't fulfill the mission. So yeah, that's all fascinating. I do either of you have anything to say? Or I'm going to look at one of the questions in the that's been asked in the chat. So Anonymous has asked, I have a disabled child who requires hospital appointments, visits. There's a fine line between parental leave and carers leave. What does this fall under? I believe it's carers leave. I think it's I think your carers leave policy should fulfill that. So at the base, your statutory fulfillment should be 5 days unpaid leave. Now your organization might have an upgrade on that and might have an elevated offering, but that does fall under carers leave. And if there is an emergency visit, then you are entitled to emergency leave as well, which is important to understand. So you've got both those facets depending on what you require, but it is always hard to know, isn't it? And I think everyone's situation isn't a one size fits all. There are people with elderly loved ones, some people with small children, some people with disabled children, adults. It's hard to know where you sit, and that's why communication is so important. So yes, I will say carers leave, I believe, is the answer to that.
Parental tends to be like maternity or paternity or adoption leave.
Yeah.
And then once they're past that point, it generally moves into carers leave, unless companies have got like a specific childcare provision.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. Otherwise, it's just been a wonderful, wonderful chat. I have to say a massive thanks to Chris and Molly for joining us today. I don't think you can underestimate just how important flexibility is today and how important it will be for the future as well. Like if you see how far we've come to where we are now, there is significant change, but there's still so much we can do. So if you do have any other questions for our guests, please reach out to us at Seniorcare by Lottie, and we'll pass you on to Molly at Flexa and Chris at Seniorcare by Lottie. And yeah, we'll be happy to give you as much flexibility, especially when it comes to caregivers, as possible. Yeah, we kind of want to eradicate the sort of the lack of diversity that can bring. So it's very important. Any final words, guys?
I would have just said thank you very much to Robin for hosting today.
Yeah, I forgot to introduce myself.
Yeah, unbelievable at filling quiet time with words and a brilliant presenter.
Well, I tried to put them in the right order. Often, like the words, you can sort of structure them just well enough. So thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. It's very kind.
No, I mean, to everyone that dialed in, thank you very much. Feel free to reach out and yeah, have a fantastic day, everyone.
Super. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Everyone, take care.